Hello and welcome to the Good Practice Podcast, a weekly show about work, performance and learning. I'm Ross Garner and this week we're chatting behaviour change. We last spoke about this topic in January when we were joined by Cathy Moore. And this time round, we're welcoming back instructional designer Julie Dirksen, author of Design for How People Learn, one of Good Practice's core texts. Hello, Julie.
Hi there.
And we're joined, of course, by regular contributor Owen Ferguson, back from his holidays, all rested and looking incredible. Hello, Owen.
Hello, Ross. Have I been relegated to a regular contributor again?
Were you a host at one point? You were during the live one, but I was being generous because it was a special occasion.
All right, okay, fair enough.
Back in your corner. Julie, we're talking about behaviour change today. Why should we care about behaviour change at all? It sounds almost sinister that we want to change people's behaviour whether they like it or not.
Well, it's funny. I was listening just the other day to somebody who was working with young adults, and they were talking about behavior modification. She kept apologizing for the phrase, and I was like, well, you might want to pick something different than behavior modification, because that does sound a little sinister. I think behavior change is a little bit more neutral, but honestly, I think the bigger issue is that when we're in learning and development, sometimes we think we're about knowledge, but I actually think everything we do has to do with behavior change. Ultimately, while in academic circles or in some things like enrichment classes, it's really just about knowing more stuff. I think in workplace, it's almost always about people doing something differently, which is all I think behavior change actually adds up to. And the loose definition that I use when I'm talking about specifically behavior change, like the sort of naughty behavior change problems that we're dealing with, is any circumstance where somebody knows what to do, but they're still not doing it. So people know they should wear their safety goggles when they're, doing something where they could, injure their eyes, but maybe they're not as consistent as we would like them to be, or people know that they should document their computer code when they're writing it, or people should know that they should, eat better and exercise more and all of those kinds of things. And yet for some reason, those things still aren't happening. And all too often our solution to that is to sort of tell them louder and more emphatically that it's really important to do that. Which doesn't seem to be working all that well. So when we start looking at some of the behavior change pieces, it becomes an issue of what are better solutions that are more helpful than that.
Yeah, I think Julie's nails it on the head. I am not sure about your characterization of behavior change as something sinister, if I'm honest, Ross, because everything we do in learning and development is about changing behavior in some way, shape or form. So whether it's about improving performance or reducing risk or increasing safety, without someone acting differently, none of those things can happen at all. And to be utterly pedantic just for a second, I know it's not like me, but it's just not possible for us to change someone's behaviour. That's still under the control of the individual themselves. So what we can do is we can make it easier for them to behave in particular ways, presumably whatever behaviour we think will lead to more successful outcomes in some way, shape or form.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to ask the ethical question. I've been working on how do I address that in my workshops and some of those kinds of things. And when we start to really dig into behavior change methods, we get into things that start to work at, say, a less explicit level. If I'm teaching you safety stuff, my agenda is pretty clear. But if I'm trying to persuade you into something and using techniques from the persuasion literature, I might be being a little bit more covert about my methods and things like that. And I think it's a very fair question whenever we're start designing things that we think might be working at a less conscious or less explicit level to ask certain ethical questions about what they're doing. And I think the whole world of technology is dealing with some of these ethical issues right now. We're dealing with it as we talk about privacy concerns, and we're dealing with it in terms of, the idea of manipulating people. And I think we need to keep an eye on that in learning and development, because I think we haven't been very good at influencing behavior in the past. So by virtue of not being that good at it, we probably aren't doing too much damage. But if we get better about it, then it starts to become question. And any kind of design has, has motives and agendas. And so therefore we should be keeping an eye on ethics. I saw a really interesting piece recently, and I wish I could remember the source of it, but they talked about how different technologies have had these moments where they've kind of realized that the things they were building weren't benign. So with chemistry, it was in the 1900s with the invention of dynamite and the realization that, the things we're building can kill lots of people. And then obviously physics had it around the invention of nuclear weapons. And now with technology, and computer programming and things like that, we're heading into this in terms of, the ability of big data and the ability to manipulate people and privacy concerns and all of those kinds of issues. And that, I think there's probably lots of computer science classes out there that don't include any discussion of ethics, but maybe that needs to change.
Yeah, I think it's I guess the question is, where does the ethical decision sit? Because by not doing something, you're already making a decision. So it's almost like the decision to be made is abstracted from one level from the activity that you're using to guide the behaviour. It's what's the intent in behind that. So if you think about a technology decision around privacy, you've kind of got two options: more private or less private. But depending on which default you choose, it's you can guide people's behaviour one way or the other. So it's not the mechanism that you're using to influence someone's behaviour. It's the decision kind of one level up from that, where the ethical decision starts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and almost all of the behavior change literature and almost everything I work on is at least neutral, if not pro-social, helping people eat better, helping people exercise more. That's where a lot of the, say, research lives, is in those kinds of things, or helping people, use condoms to be safer, or, whatever those things are. By and large, there's been, something that I think most of us could agree was a positive that people were working on.
I think it almost happens the other way around. So I feel like the nudge is haunting this discussion so far. We're sort of tiptoeing around a lot of the sort of Thaler and Sunstein stuff around how decisions are structured, and our old friend on this podcast, libertarian paternalism, which is that society generally knows best what you want, and you're not making the best choices, so we're going to help you do the thing that you want to do anyway, but for whatever reason don't. But a lot of these things kind of already happened for evil, in the sense that marketing were already doing it. So if you're going to say, you'd have ads that would have, this is what successful, attractive people are doing with their time, was kind of then flipped and nudged to this is what people like you are doing. It's almost, it's come out of the kind of manipulative realm and turned into this sort of weirdly paternal approach.
Yeah, and obviously advertising, absolutely has been using all of these strategies for ages. And some of it becomes a question of what's the ethical boundaries? Because if you disclose some of these things, it doesn't mean that they don't work. So if I say, we are organizing this cafeteria so that you will make healthier choices, you can tell people about that. And some people may be contrary and decide that, they're going to deliberately circumvent whatever you're doing. But other people will, kind of go, okay, and, be fine with that. The issue of the libertarian paternalism and the Sunstein and Thaler stuff was the idea of, can you do things where you don't take people's choices away, but you help them make better choices? And within the behavior change, it's a fairly common accepted idea that there's different, innately in you, there's different influencers who are helping with your decision making. And if you're reading Daniel Kahneman, he's talking about system 1, system 2. The metaphor that I usually use for it is the one from Jonathan Haidt, which talks about the rider and the elephant. And so they talk about the elephant being this visceral, emotional part of your brain. So the part of your brain that hits the snooze button when you're in, bed on a cold morning and it's nice and warm and comfortable, even though your rider knows that this is going to cause you a whole bunch of hassle later on, your elephant is like, it's warm and it's nice and it's pleasant right here. I think we should stay a little longer.
Yeah, so the rider is like the logical part of the brain and wants to do certain things, and the elephant will go to a certain extent, but then it's distracted by some nuts. And it's often the elephant that takes over and makes decisions for us.
But the issue is almost every behavior change problem have delayed or absent feedback. So if you start an exercise program today and you enjoy the act of exercising, it pays off right away. But if you're starting an exercise program and you don't enjoy exercising, you don't see positive benefits from that for, 4 weeks, 6 weeks, months, maybe, depending on...
I'm still waiting.
Yeah, I know, right? And so that means your elephant is like, is basically fighting you this whole time. Your rider is dragging that elephant along on this, as opposed to if you like exercise, your elephant's like, hey, this is fun. I'm having a good time. I've done some work with Michelle Segar at the University of Michigan, and she looks at exercise motivation. And she's found very conclusively in a lot of her research that the nearer you can view the reward of exercising. So if I go for a walk this afternoon, that will relax me and I'll be kind of able to be more energetic for my afternoon work. If that's an immediate payoff, and that form of exercise motivation pushed closer to the point of action is a much more durable form of exercise motivation. Because if your motivation is at some point I will get in shape, which also is a very intangible form. So tangibility matters. Immediacy matters, tangibility matters, likelihood matters, and how big the reward is matters. So those kinds of factors really influence whether I'm going to take action today or whether I'm not going to take action today on these things, and how long can I force myself to take action versus this is something that either doesn't feel onerous to me or at least I feel like I'm getting some kind of immediate benefit from it.
Yeah, and this is one of the key things, isn't it? Is that immediate gratification versus long-term benefit, and whilst humans have evolved, we've not evolved that much. And so, Julie, you were talking about how animals have less of this tendency, but actually it's quite a good evolutionary strategy to, or alternatively, we have evolved to get gratification things that were good evolutionary strategies for when we were hunter-gatherers on the savannah, but not necessarily great when we're dealing with complex financial instruments like pensions, for example.
Right. Well, and one of the really classic examples is an attraction to high calorically dense foods was a survival strategy when you had to basically, put in a full day to get to scrape together 1,200 calories. An attraction to high calorically dense foods is, can be lethal if you live in a world with, chips and sodas and, all of these kinds of things where you basically have unlimited calories at your disposal. And we tend to blame individual behaviors for things like the rise in obesity and so forth. But if you think about what's changed in the last 60, 70 years, human nature hasn't fundamentally changed in 70 years. What's changed in the last 70 years is, in 1950, families had no car, had one car, no cars, nobody worried about screen time. The average size of a soda bottle in the US was 8 ounces. I think somewhere I have a picture of, I think it's like a 216 ounce like soda container or something like that. It's like a cooler just for soda. But the environment has changed around people, but we insist that like personal willpower should be the solution to the fact that your environment has radically changed around you and created an abundance of problematic, foods and calorie sources that, the change is clearly environmental, but we keep kind of harping on individual behavior as a solution to it. And that's a place where things like the libertarian paternalism becomes an issue, because they've tried in some of the U.S. cities to say limit the size of soda containers. Like you can't sell more than like 64 ounce or something, which is insane right there. But people view that as an incursion of personal liberties and fight it, tooth and nail. And so we're creating environments where these behaviors are getting harder and harder to do. So something like healthy eating, and yet the only answer that we seem to have as a society is to continually shame the individuals who operate in these environments and struggle with these kinds of things.
Yeah, and to loop it back to L&D, I think for some people they believe surely just making people aware that is the case is enough. If we just tell them that doing that thing is bad for them, we have we've absolved ourselves of our responsibility. Therefore, they will change their behavior, and that's akin to just providing someone with more information in an L&D context. It needs to be more than just that.
Yeah, I think this is something that comes up an awful lot in compliance in particular, which if you take like cybersecurity or data protection or something like that, why are people sending like massive databases of email addresses over email versus over like the slightly complicated sort of convoluted file transfer process that's in place where you have to, get a secondary code to prove who you are and all that kind of stuff. And the reason people don't do it is because they can't be honest. Like it's much faster not to do that. If you do it, there's going to be probably no consequences. If there are consequences, it'll probably be miles down the road. They might be able to trace it back to you, but they might not. And like the previous 10 times where you've just sent the database via email, it's been fine. So who cares? I've got a stack of other stuff to do.
Well, and I talk about sometimes the issue of, I think we would all agree with the statement that people learn from experience, but a lot of times what they learn from experience isn't the desired behavior. So what they've learned from that experience is using the official, route for sending this data is just nightmarishly difficult, and that nothing bad happened the 19 times that I sent it this other way. The texting while driving is a classic example of that. We're putting these messages out about texting while driving, and the best PSAs kind of do the emotional appeal, which is probably going to ultimately, it's more effective than just yelling at people, but how much more effective is a different question. But the issue is a lot of times this message is going out to people who have done this literally dozens, hundreds of times and gotten away with it. And so you can tell their riders intellectually that this is a bad idea, but their elephants are like, nope, I'm pretty sure we got this. And we know that doesn't mean that person won't still have an accident tomorrow and, kill themselves or other people potentially, and that it's a very bad thing. But the likelihood feels so low to them because they have this counter experience that, there's nothing you can say to that person. They have to have an experience that's counter to what their previous experience has been, which is where we get into things like using virtual reality for behavior change. There's a lot of really interesting stuff in there in terms of experiencing, physically experiencing the consequences of something. They've been working on that with texting while driving, and I don't know that I've seen anybody actually tracking results on it because it's a hard thing to measure, but there's certainly been attempts. If you experience in a VR environment the consequences of texting while driving, does that make it less likely that you're going to text while driving? And like I said, I don't have any data on that one, but we do know it about some other things. One of my favorite researchers in this is Jeremy Bailenson, who's at the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Laboratory. And they look a lot at the question of if you experience the consequence of something, is that going to change your behavior? And my favorite study on this one is they do a lesson on using less disposable paper, sort of an environmental focus. So if you use this many paper towels or, the really nice unrecycled toilet paper, or, whatever it is, how many trees get cut down to basically support your disposable paper habit over the course of the year. And And so half of the group, everybody learns, this many trees get cut down for your paper. Half of the group goes into kind of a cognitive condition where they read about cutting down trees. And the other half go into a virtual reality condition where they're cutting down virtual trees with a virtual chainsaw. And you get the sound effects. And when the tree falls down, the floor kind of shakes and the whole thing. And then then they will ask them afterwards, do you intend to use less paper? And it's, they're in California, they're environmentally aware. Everybody says, yes, I intend to use less paper, which is the rider projecting out into the future about consequences. But then they do this thing where the experimenter accidentally, quote unquote, spills a glass of water, and then they count how many pieces of paper towel they use to mop up the spill. And the people who were in the visceral condition where they're actually experiencing the thing used almost 20% on average less than the people who had been in the cognitive condition.
So I think that there's sort of two big tools for changing behavior. And so one is the experiential part. So, I think we've spoken about this before on the podcast, but one of the best ways to get people to take fire safety seriously would be to set their office on fire or set their trash can on fire, or for cybersecurity, first day, send them an email, welcome to the company. Here's this attachment you'll need. And they click on it and it takes over their computer, right? So let's just scare the shit out of people. But then the car example, technically it's a slightly difficult one, but there are loads of examples of where the driving environment has been changed to shape people's behavior. So there's when you don't have your seatbelt on and it starts making that ping noise. And that ping is immediate feedback, ping, ping, ping. And it's so annoying that you'll put your seatbelt on straight away. And then there's, cat's eyes in the road so you can see where you're going. And then there's the friction that you get when you kind of drift off the side of the road. These are all sort of very minor changes to the environment that you're making driving decisions in. But they shape the way that you behave.
Well, and that's an interesting area because that's usually a tool set that we're not availing ourselves of learning and development. We decided that if I'm trying to change the person or change what they know, then it's an L&D problem. If I'm trying to change the environment that they're in, it's up to user experience or product design or, people like that. And I think...
Or facilities management as well. It's where are the recycle bins placed to encourage people to use them, that kind of
Absolutely. And there's a lot of cases where changing the environment is far more effective than trying to change the person. One of my other favorite examples, if you've ever been to a Google office, that one of the best things about going to Google is the food's really good. And they've also done a lot of this sort of nudging in their cafeterias and things like that. But if you go into the little micro kitchens, they did one, it was in the New York office, where they had these gravity bins, which are the clear plastic bins where you can put your cup underneath and lift the thing up and M&Ms would fall from the gravity bin into your cup. And there was a thing at Google, which was sort of, I don't know if you have it in the UK, but we talk about the freshman 15 here, which is the 15 pounds that often college students gain when they first go off to college because the first time you're making all your own food choices and you're eating in cafeterias and, whether that food's healthy or not or things like that. And there's sort of an equivalent at Google where, people would start to put on weight when they started working there because even though the food's healthy and wonderful, there's so much of it. And so they started asking some questions about, can we, without taking food away, which again is that libertarian paternalism idea, can we help people, make better choices about it? And so sometimes you go in and they have the little packets of M&Ms instead of a big thing where they just fall from the sky. You get little, the small packets and there's not too many of them. So there's you feel bad if you took 6 or something. But the other solution is, how do I make this less appealing to the elephant? So it's more of the rider making the decision. And they took the M&Ms and instead of being in a clear bin where you can see the pretty colors and, where it's hard to manage how much you're getting because they're just falling into your cup or whatever it is. They put them in opaque containers with a little scoop and kind of smaller containers next to it rather than a cup or something like that. And so you can still take as many M&Ms as you want, but you are making a little bit more of a deliberate decision about it. And, your eye isn't being immediately captured by them. And it's a little harder to take lots and lots of M&Ms and things like that. And, they did a 6-week study in, New York. And I want to say it's about 7 million calories less consumed in M&Ms over that 6 weeks. So it's an enormous amount. And they do the same thing with drinks, where you can still get like a Mountain Dew or a Coke or something like that, but it's behind the frosted glass panel at the bottom of the cooler case instead of being like right at eye level. And they dramatically reduce the consumption of sugared beverages by putting kind of water at eye level and sort of not hiding, but making slightly less visible.
Make it slightly more difficult to access the thing that's bad for you.
Mm.
Yep.
I want to wrap this up by just looping it back to Owen, if that's okay. Because Owen, at the start, you said it was impossible to change anyone's behavior. They have to decide to make that change themselves. And I think this whole conversation has been about the lack of agency that people actually have in the decisions that the day-to-day decisions that they make. It's almost entirely...
No.
I knew you would say no, but I'm interested in how you're going to say it.
No, because ultimately the people can still do the thing that in the long term is going to cause them harm. So, with Julie's examples in Google, that people can still overload on M&Ms. It's just more difficult for them to do that. So effectively you're introducing some kind of friction to persuade people against doing something that is suboptimal, either for them or for the organization, and you make it easier for them to make things that are more beneficial. So these behavior change things ultimately are you make it easier to do the right thing or harder to do the wrong thing, right and wrong in sort of quotation marks, that going back to that ethical decision. But ultimately it is up to the person themselves. So even with the sort of the classic examples of organ donation, right? Introducing an opt-out system rather than opt-in system, you can still opt out. You just have to take action to do that. You can still opt out of pension schemes if you want to, but you need to take positive action to make that happen. So you're not forcing people down a particular path, but you are making it. You're changing the amount of effort that's required to make one decision or another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the pension schemes one is an interesting one, because in the US we have what's referred to as 401ks, and your employer will usually offer a 401k plan, or they can offer you like multiple. So it's like different funds that you can buy into with your retirement savings, basically. And one of the things they did find was that people were much more likely to opt into the 401ks if they didn't give them too many options to choose from. So in a situation where they gave them like 21 401ks to choose from, people get overwhelmed and then they can't make a decision at all. But if they give them 6, then people can kind of narrow down and go, okay, I want that one. And so that's a case where, again, it's not that the person didn't want a 401k, but they, you present them with options that are overwhelming, and they, it's easier to not make a decision at that point. And so, obviously there are virtuous examples of this where the person wants to do the thing, the organization wants them to do the thing, and now it's just a matter of how do we make it as easy as possible to do the thing.
There was, I think we'll wrap up here, but Freakonomics just did a kind of live panel show on behavior change, and they talked about the pension example, giving employees at a large company, I think 42 different options, and the bulk of them chose an option that no economist would choose. The vast majority picked suboptimal options. They would be the amount that they were paying each month was more than they would save, off the excess when they actually went to get treatment, that kind of thing. People are not good at making these decisions because they probably only do it once every few years.
Which is, again, which is one of the reasons why defaults are something that that are used in these libertarian paternalistic systems.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I'll just make one pitch for if people want to learn more about this. One of the best resources on this is something that's referred to as the Behavior Change Wheel, or COMBI, which is Susan Mickey is the principal investigator, and she's got a group at University College London and their Center for Behavior Change, and they do. What they found is that there's these little models popping up, and there's the behavioral economic stuff, and there's this motivation model and this thing over here. And they did a massive kind of survey across the research literature to look at all of the different behavior change models and kind of reconcile it into sort of a meta model, which is what the behavior change wheel stuff is. And they look at fundamentally, do people have the capability to do the thing? And it could be physical capability or it could be psychological capability. They look at, do they have the opportunity? So does their physical environment support it? And does their social environment support it? Are they seeing the behavior modeled? If they do the thing, will they get social support? Those kinds of questions. And then they look at, do they have the motivation to do the thing? And that there's reflective motivation, which is I'm deliberately setting a goal to exercise more. And then there's automatic motivation, which is your habits or your, kinds of feelings about exercise that aren't necessarily consciously available to you, but that may be influencing some of your choices there. And then beneath that, they get into things like, some specific issues and strategies that kind of fall underneath that. But they've also got a library of there's a free app called the BCT taxonomy, which is behavior change techniques taxonomy, that they've identified 93 different things that have been studied in the research literature around doing these things. And some of them are stuff that falls outside of L&D, like incentives or environmental changes. But a lot of it falls into, things that we do have some control or influence over when we're dealing with learning and development. And so if people want to learn more about it, that's a fantastic resource.
I've never heard of that, but we'll link to it in the show notes. You heard it here first, people. No excuse. Let's now wrap up and move on to our regular feature of What I Learned This Week, where we share something we picked up over the past 7 days. Owen, do you want to go first?
Sure. So mine's a little bit of a cheat because it's something that I revisited while I was on holiday. But one of the things I love to do most when I'm on holiday in Europe is go to the local markets because the food produce is always amazing. And something that a friend noted was how there was no plastic packaging at the market, and what a waste of all the packaging used in UK supermarkets were. And it brought to mind a podcast that I listened to called 50 Things That Changed the Modern Economy. And this particular episode was about cellophane. But in it, they discussed plastic packaging in general and how it's not such a cut and dry ethical issue as you might think. So, for example, shrink-wrapped cucumbers seem like a ridiculous waste of packaging, but they stay fresh for 14 days compared to 3 days if they don't have the shrink-wrapped packaging. And a decade ago, a UK supermarket experimented with taking its fruit and veg out of its packaging and just putting it on display au natural. And what they found was that food wastage doubled. Another supermarket stopped using the plastic wrapped trays for its apples, and instead what they did is they transported them and sold them from big cardboard boxes. But so many apples were damaged in transit that they actually used more packaging per apple sold than they did with the smaller plastic wrapped trays. So these things are not always so ethically obvious as you might think from social media outrage that's out there. And so, I mean, going back to sort of conversation that we've just had, you need to think carefully about what behaviour you're trying to incentivize and whether it's the right thing or not.
Yeah, I almost went down a rabbit hole when Julie gave the paper example earlier on, because I had recently heard someone making a staunch defense that, paper is a sustainable resource. We can grow as many trees as we require for the amount of paper that we need. And then it's also a 100% recyclable resource as well. It can be reused for something else. And that paper is unfairly harangued compared to alternatives. The argument was like using email, which uses electricity, which I'm slightly dubious about. But I hadn't thought of it as being not as damaging as it at first appears. Julie, feel free to, by the way, to defend your paper example. But have you learned something this week?
You know what? I've been trying to learn a little bit about marketing, and it turns out I'm really bad at it. But I'm trying to get better at it. I'm trying to learn about marketing strategimes and
sexy successful people.
Yes, exactly. Sexy successful people. And although I found that I'm really responding awfully well to marketing that shows kind of normal people in the stuff, like attractive normal people, but like not necessarily it makes me really happy to see people in advertising who actually look like, people I know, as opposed to sexy, successful people.
Yeah,
but it
I
could
watched
be
that
one of
Hugo
those.
Boss advert. I think I'm not fooled. No way a squirt of that is going to make me look like him.
Yeah. So although, it's probably like the plastic packaging where I like it, but does it make me actually buy stuff more? I don't know, but that kind of thing. So
fun. So I went to see Fast and the Furious presents Hobbs and Shaw at the cinema last night. Either of you familiar with the Fast and the Furious franchise?
Oh yeah.
So I have seen no films in this franchise before, but understood it to be about street racing. That is not what this film was about. It was like a Saturday Night Live sketch about The Rock and Jason Statham accidentally end up on the same plane and don't get along. But it went on for what felt like 7 hours as like a science fiction action film. It was easily the worst film I've ever seen in cinema. But what really struck me watching it, and I had time to think all this while sitting there waiting for it to end, was that they had this really long car chase in London. It was filmed in Glasgow, and it was specifically filmed in George Square in Glasgow, and specifically going round and round George Square something like 20 times. So I lived in Glasgow for 10 years, and I couldn't tell you anything that was happening during the car chase because I was so busy going, there's Greg's, and there's the student union, and there's the council chamber. And it just reminded me how important details are to an expert. And like when you were designing for experts, it's easy to think, well, we know enough to make this, this scenario seem authentic. But you really have to test that thinking, because an expert is going to notice all the ways that's just not quite right. And that can suck them right out of it.
Yeah, I wish I could find this post again. I've looked for it a few times and I never found it again. But somebody was talking about how, I think it was somebody in India, like an e-learning developer, and they were talking about how even getting one kind of specific thing wrong can sort of ruin the experience. And they were talking about how they'd gotten DVDs of some big action movies and then realized they'd gotten the dubbed versions. So they're dubbed in Hindi and the dubbing was bad. And it just kind of ruined the experience for them, despite the fact that it had amazing visuals, amazing production values, great music, good acting. It was a good action movie in every other particular, but just this annoying one thing kind of kept pulling them out of the experience. And, it's hard to get this stuff right. It's not a simple thing.
Yeah, I mean, I'm slightly astonished. Have there not been 7 Fast and Furious films before this one?
I believe so, yes.
So you chose to go to see the 8th film in a
well, so,
and are astonished that you weren't really quite following quite what was going on.
Oh no, like there was nothing going on.
Well, how do you know? Might have been.
The plot was absolutely. I've got my brother has moved in with me for a few months. He's just moved to Inverness, and he's been a big fan of the franchise, and so he wanted to go, and he thought it was fine. And that's it. That's all from us. If you'd like to get in touch with us about anything we've said on the show, you can tweet me at RossGarnerGP. You can tweet Owen
at Owen Ferguson,
and you can tweet Julie
at Usable Learning.
You can also tweet at Good Practice or at Good Practice AUS. Julie, do you want to do any marketing?
Yeah, I should, shouldn't I? I have a course on designing for attention and engagement for students. It's available at designbetterlearning.com.
Great. I'm about halfway through it. It's very nicely bite-sized. You can dip in and out in the flow of work, which I'm enjoying immensely. If you've enjoyed the show, please give us a review, but more important than that, tell someone you love about it. Give them the same joy that you've just experienced. Owen thanks you in advance. You can also find out more about Good Practice at goodpractice.com, where you'll find our back catalogue of podcasts and details of our award-winning performance support toolkit. I never leave home without it, because it's a website, and I always have my phone with me. We hope you've enjoyed the show, and thank you for listening all the way to the end. You are my favourite listener. Until next time, bye for now.